Thank you so much for joining us for this evening's event. My name is Nick, and I'm one of the events hosts here at Powell's Books. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. One of the many events we're looking forward to is American Prometheus author Kai Bird in conversation with TJ Stiles about Bird's new book, The Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter. Next week on Wednesday, the 23rd, if you don't already do so, please follow us on social media to find out about these and other events. So tonight we are thrilled to welcome Daisy Hernández and Amy Stewart. Daisy Hernández is a former reporter for the New York Times and has been writing about the intersections of race, immigration, class, and sexuality for almost 2 decades. Her most recent book, for which she joins us this evening, is The Kissing Bug, a true story of family, an insect, and a nation's neglect for a deadly disease. She has written for National Geographic, NPR's All Things Considered, and Code Switch, The Atlantic, Slate, and Guernica. And she is the author of the award-winning memoir, A Cup of Water Under My Bed. Growing up in New Jersey, in a New Jersey factory town in the 1980s, Hernández believed that her aunt had become deathly ill from eating an apple. No one in her family in either the United States or Colombia spoke of infectious diseases, and even into her 30s, she only knew that her aunt had died of a rare illness called Chagas. But as Hernández dug deeper, she discovered that Chagas, or the kissing bug disease, is more prevalent in the United States than the Zika virus. Today, more than 300,000 Americans have Chagas. Why do some infectious diseases make headlines and others fall by the wayside? After her aunt's death, Hernández began searching for answers about who our nation chooses to take care of and who we ignore. Crisscrossing the country, she interviews patients, epidemiologists, and even veterinarians with the Department of Defense. Hernández's new book, The Kissing Bug, tells the story of how poverty, racism, and public policies have conspired to keep this disease hidden, and how this disease intersects with Hernández's own identity as a niece, sister, daughter, a queer woman, a writer and a researcher, and a citizen of a country that is only beginning to address the harms caused by Chagas and the dangers it poses. A riveting and nuanced investigation into racial politics and for-profit healthcare in the United States, The Kissing Bug reveals the intimate history of a marginalized disease and connects us to the lives at the center of it all. Joining Hernández in conversation this evening is Amy Stewart. Stewart is the New York Times bestselling author of the Cop Sisters series, which are based on the true story of one of America's first female deputy sheriffs and her 2 rambunctious sisters. Her popular nonfiction titles include The Drunken Botanist, Wicked Bugs, Wicked Plants, and Flower Confidential. Her books have sold over 1 million copies worldwide and have been translated into 17 languages. This evening's event will also include an audience Q&A, so please keep the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well as if someone has typed a question that you'd like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Most importantly, please consider supporting Daisy and Powell's by purchasing a copy of her new book from us. A link to buying The Kissing Bug along with Amy's books will be shared in the chat a couple times this evening. So Daisy, Amy, what a joy to welcome you both, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Amy, for joining me.
Oh, thanks. You know, I live in the same neighborhood with your publisher, Tin House. They're just up the street. And the way I found out about your book is that I dropped by Tin House, I can't remember, to drop something off. And they handed me a copy of the galley. And I immediately, like, I saw the cover, that's all I knew about it. And I immediately went on this rant about insect transmitted diseases. So before, when you read in a few minutes, we'll explore the personal side of this story. But the first thing that I wanted to say to you and to the audience is that I really became interested in the issue of insect transmitted diseases when I was writing Wicked Bugs, which looks like kind of a goofy little gifty book, but I really did a lot of research. And what really struck me about insect transmitted diseases, and the thing that I would go around the country telling audiences is, I'm going to tell you all these stories about these creepy bugs and the diseases they transmit in far-flung places that maybe you've never been to. And you might be thinking that the reason we don't have them here in the United States is that we got lucky. We just picked the right country to come to, our ancestors. But the fact is that in the United States, we have good sanitation, we have medicine, we have pest control, we have a number of ways of helping people deal with a public health crisis that is insect transmitted disease, and we choose not to share that with the rest of the world. And that's why some of these things happen in other places, but not here. But of course, even in the United States, we're familiar with Lyme disease and other types of insect transmitted diseases, but just on a very different scale. So I was so excited about this book, even though it's a tough story to tell, because I just feel like we don't fully grasp these stories, and you've made it real and you've made it very human, and it's a family story that we can all connect to. So thank you for this book.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I agree with everything you're saying. We've invested in very particular ways in this country against infectious diseases, and in specific communities in this country as well. So yeah, decisions have been made that protect us. Absolutely.
Right. So there are so many things that I want to talk to you about that have to do with the memoir side, but I'm also really interested in the research. So I know there's a bunch that we can get into. Do you want to read now, and then we go from there into the rest of the conversation?
Yes, I am
Good.
happy. I'm happy to read. Yeah, so I want to read. I was reminded that you wrote about Charles Darwin in your book Wicked Bugs, so I thought I would read from that section in my book too. So it's a a bringing together of memoir and journalism to write about the kissing bug disease, or Chagas disease, which my auntie was diagnosed with, and after many years lost her life to this disease. And in its chronic form, it does not have a cure. It's a parasitic disease, and the parasite usually goes after the heart. And I didn't get all that information when I was growing up. The information I got was, as Nick was describing, that my auntie must have eaten some kind of fruit in her home country, and the parasite was transmitted that way. So part of the book is also, sort of describing, making sense of this disease, both as a child and then as an adult and as a journalist, being able to do research. So I'm going to read from a chapter called Bichos, and I think all you need to know is that it's my tia Dora, my auntie who was diagnosed with this disease and who lost her life to it, and it's Auntie Biblia. So that just means it was sort of, my auntie's nickname was like the Bible auntie, simply not because she is very religious, but she was nicknamed that way because she has a very long memory and seems to hold on to every family story on behalf of everyone in the family. So that was her nickname. And she's the one who began, when I was a child, to explain the disease to me. Auntie Biblia's stories were akin to praying the rosary. They repeated. She moved about our kitchen table with pomegranate lipstick and her tall tales about Colombia's beauty pageants and priests who wanted more than limosna. Her story about how Tia Dora had almost died when she was young. That's how sick she was. I might have been almost 15 when the kitchen started to feel crowded for my arms and legs, my new height, which at 5 feet 2 inches felt quite tall. Thinking about my Tia Dora, I asked, how could eating a fruit almost kill her? It was contaminated, Auntie Biblia answered, matter of fact. But how? A bicho. The fruit was contaminated by a bicho. Bicho is a Spanish word for insect. It can also mean a man's penis, and in some parts of Latin America, it can mean a little devil. Years later, when I started reading about kissing bugs, I did not know what I would find, but I absolutely did not expect to come across Charles Darwin. In 1835, Darwin was 26 and 4 years into his trip through South America, the one that gave him the basis for his book on the origin of species. In March of that year, he and his guide rode mules through the plains of Argentina. The land was flat and the air hot, and for a full day, Darwin found no water and only a few houses. When they neared the village of Lujan de Cuyo, he noticed a field the color of blood, a locust invasion. People raced from their cottages and set branches on fire and waved the torch bark at the locusts. They shouted, hoping the noise and the smoke would turn away the tiny beasts, but nothing worked. Darwin rode on. The men had 10 mules with them, and when they all finally escaped the locusts and reached Lujan de Cuyo, Darwin expected to sleep well. The village was nestled among gardens. It boasted a river and rows of poplars and willows. Who does not sleep like a king under a willow tree? But when Darwin closed his eyes that night in Argentina, the kissing bugs crept out from their hiding places. And the insects did not care if it was Charles Darwin or not. The sun had vanished. Ravenous, they set off for the evening, creeping onto his body. They expected him to be asleep. They expected to feed on him. But Darwin was awake and horrified. And later, despite being a man of science, he wrote how disgusting it was to feel these bichos, these insects, quote, nearly an inch long and black and soft, crawling in all parts of your person, gorged with your blood. The kissing bugs came to be known as triotomine insects and classified in that a family of assassin bugs or reduvid insects for their vampire-like tendencies. All over the Americas, however, people adopted other names. Here in Texas and the Southwest, people have called the kissing bug a bloodsucker. And in Argentina and Bolivia, people say it's a vinchuca, a word that probably comes from Quechua, a language that millions of people speak today in South America and that dates back to the Inca Empire. Vinchuca means bug that lets itself fall, and is probably a reference to how these insects slip out from the crevices in the walls of houses made from mud and sticks, falling toward the bodies of their sleeping victims. In Central America and Mexico, people say the kissing bug is a chinche, a name that's also used for bed bugs. Years after I had grown up and left home, a man from Mexico tried to explain it to me this way. There are little chinches and there are big chinches. The kissing bug, he told me, is a big chinche. I'll stop there. Thanks for listening, everyone.
So I have a special surprise guest today for our event.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so right here,
Yes.
that's your little friend.
That
I
is
have
a
this,
kissing
I'm
bug.
sorry, this is probably super gross. There's probably people who are like fleeing right now.
Yes.
I had this made up. These are all very, 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 very naughty insects, and an entomologist made this for me, and I traveled with it. But that's what it looks like. So you guys can see. This is it's kind of a medium-sized one, but you can see sort of about how big they are, and that's their deal.
Yeah, the audience won't know this, but when I began this project, I was terrified of insects. Amy, I would have gone like this immediately. That's been sort of a strange part of this journey is kind of battling that fear that I had of things that crept and crawled through the world.
Right. Well, we all have these kind of stories in our families that we sort of grow up with, and that we've sort of absorbed maybe a certain mythology about what happened, and we don't question it. And then there comes a point when we question it. And so I wonder if you can talk about that. Like what was that process like for you? And at what moment did you start to realize, like, I think there's more to this, and maybe this is something I want to dig into some more?
Yeah, that's something that I really tried to document in writing this book, because it was a little bit like sort of breadcrumbs through my childhood, through my growing up. So I was translating for my auntie when I was 6 years old. At that point, she understood English, but she was not English dominant. So I was in first grade, and I was her voice between her and a nurse who was sent to the house when she was in between surgeries. She was very lucky to be diagnosed in the United States in New York City by a doctor there. So I knew at an early age there was something happening with my auntie, but didn't quite know what it was. And then when I was 13, and another family member told me, oh, it's because of some contaminated fruit that she ate. And then as I just read when I was 15, it was like, oh, wait, the fruit has something to do with an insect. There was never any language around, insect transmitted disease or zoonotic disease, sort of none of that language around science and medicine. And then when I was a little bit older, like in high school, was when I first heard that Chagas was not just this random name for a disease, but that the disease had been named after Dr. Carlos Chagas from Brazil, who discovered the disease in 1909. And that was quite a shock. I remember, and I write about this in the book, of just realizing like, oh, this whole time I thought it was like some fancy Latin medical term, but it was actually a person. Like there's a person who discovered this and is connected with this. And then when I was older, I learned a little bit more as my auntie was over, decades going in and out of hospitals, being affected in different, for her it was her gastrointestinal system. So I knew from the medical caretaking side, the kind of impact that the parasite could have, but it wasn't really until she died, which was really quite a shock for me at the time, because I think it's hard for people who don't have a chronic family member to understand that you kind of, the kind of magical thinking that you get into over the years, because you're just constantly in hospitals, the person's constantly very, very sick, that you just think, well, they're just sick again. It's just one of those times again. So the end of her life was quite a shock. And when I started researching is when I found out, oh, this isn't rare at all. There's 300,000 people in the United States who have this disease. And they are all like my auntie. They are immigrants from South or Central America or Mexico. And very few of them know that they're infected, because the parasite can be dormant in your body your whole life. Actually, it's only 1 in 3 people who are infected who go on to develop usually cardiac complications. So it was actually in the wake of her death and that I started to actually put more of the pieces together, including that my family was not totally lying to me about the fruit. You can have fruit that's infected with these insects, but usually it leads to acute outbreaks in groups of people because it's been transmitted in juice or in some kind of food, which was not the case for my auntie. She probably had exposure to the insect at some point. So yeah, it was quite a long journey of putting the pieces together. And it sounds so coherent when I tell you about it now, but while I was writing it, it was like sort of holding, trying to do the, 10,000 puzzle piece. It felt like a lot of information I was holding at the same time.
Well, I think that's, in some ways, that's sort of true of any book. When you look at the finished book, it all seems so obvious and it all seems so clear. But when we're writing and when we're muddling through it and when we're just sort of grappling with the story and deciding, is this a book or isn't this a book? Like none of that is clear.
So true.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things about this book is that it feels to me like it's very much a part of a particular kind of science writing that's very immersive, and blends so beautifully a first-person story with an investigative journalist's research perspective. And also, you were talking about that Chagas is a real person. And like, what's so interesting to me about science is it's all real people. Like it's like science is a story that we tell ourselves about the world we live in. That's what it is. And scientists are the storytellers. They are the ones who are figuring it out and putting it together so that the rest of us can understand it. And so like, I really think about Rebecca Skloot, Henrietta Lacks is a story that she kind of became personally involved with and is also a story about people. And in some ways, Mary Roach, because she immerses herself. I mean, it's generally not a family connection, but she's nonetheless putting herself in the story and you get to read about like how scientists actually do their work. And so I wonder, like, when you were thinking about writing this, did you sort of, like now it just looks like a beautifully done thing, this book. But was there a time when you were like, what is this even going to be? How am I going to work out how to tell this story?
It's so interesting that you mentioned those two books in particular, because I studied those books very carefully. Because initially I actually was not planning to include any memoir. I thought it would maybe be on the Rebecca Skloot side of the coin, where I would write more intimately about the patients that I met. So I give full credit to my amazing Tin House editor, Macy Cochran, who was like, what about memoir? What about the story with your auntie? And she was the one who really teased that out. And then also really in that process of writing that, I realized, oh my gosh, that voice, that intimate voice is what needs to be the backbone here, whether I'm talking about my kind of complicated mother-daughter relationship with her, or whether I'm talking to a biologist in South America. Like, that voice is what's consistent. Because you're right, that's what I was seeing in those books. And I studied Mary Roach's books too, especially the one on the cadavers was so fantastic. And what I saw was that, like, no matter where she went, it was her voice. It was like that intimate quality to the voice that was, it was not only introducing me to people and to places, but then also it's the same voice that was explaining the science and making it, a text that I wanted to read, as opposed to a text that I wanted to avoid. So yeah, I did think about that a lot. And yeah, it was a very conscious decision to, like, have that voice, be the anchor through the book. And sort of like the guide for people, because I knew that there would be readers who, I hope that there would be readers who would maybe shy away from a book about medicine and science, who would pick up this one. So I thought about that a lot. Like, I want them invested in this, but it's a juggling act, right? It's a juggling act. And I came to appreciate much more deeply what science journalists have been doing for a long time. And especially, as you're saying, immersive, because I did, like, for example, I did end up, we have these insects in the United States. They're usually in the southern part of the country. They're all over California and in the Southwest, and Texas has quite a number of species of them. So having started out being terrified of insects, I ended up in Texas, seeing, I wanted to see what researchers were doing there. So I went out hunting for kissing bugs in the middle of the night and found out exactly what it looks like, which is, it was just kind of shocking that it was so easy to track them, actually, is what was surprising for me. But also really amazing to see, as you're saying, it's like, these are real people, and they load up the truck with all of their equipment and they spend hours out there, looking at bugs, hoping to catch what they came to catch, and it's just fascinating, actually.
If the scientists you connected with were more eager to talk to you because of the connection you had, like, were you forthcoming with that? Like, this is, I'm not just any journalist. I've got a family story here. And do you feel like maybe that made them more open and more welcoming and more willing to give you the time?
Yeah, with scientists and doctors, initially, I was not disclosing a personal connection.
Oh.
And so I had some interesting interviews with them where toward the end of my interviews, they would suddenly say, why are you interested in this? Because just a lot of people, as you know, have not been interested in the disease. I mean, it's neglected. It's on that, like, World Health Organization list of neglected diseases around the world. So they would kind of be they would kind of remember or think of it as an afterthought, like, why do you care, of all people? And sometimes they would ask, because I'm Latinx, or they heard my last name, if we were doing a phone interview, they would say, is there any chance that you have a connection with Chagas disease with your family background? So yeah, and the reason that I didn't mention it, I'm trying to think, I was not planning to do anything memoir at the beginning. So I was like, why would I disclose this? And then as it went on, I think, it's just, I have like that, very classic journalism training. And so you never reveal anything personal. However, when I approach families, I always shared that first, because I grew up in a working class immigrant family. Like, I completely understand some of the dynamics that are at play there when a stranger shows up at your door and is asking about your medical history and your medical experiences. And usually I had a connection either through another patient or a doctor, but I still felt like, I know it's going to create a certain sense of ease if I disclose that I had an auntie who was diagnosed with this disease. It was tricky, however, Amy, because so many times patients wanted to know what had happened for her, and I couldn't say, oh, she's managing her symptoms, where she's good, she's well, I couldn't say any of that, and it was always very painful to have to tell them that she had ultimately died from the disease. So it was I think it put them at ease, but it also created, put me in a different, I wasn't a traditional journalist in that sense when I was interviewing patients. It was definitely, I was like inhabiting multiple positions at the same time. But some of the patients I ended up interviewing over the span of several years, many visits, spent time with them in hospitals. So the relationships also changed over time too.
And then maybe you can talk, and for folks who haven't read the book, talk a little bit about what it's like bringing this information back to your family. From the piece you read, people will understand that there were stories in the family about what was wrong with your aunt. And so here you go off finding out what really went on and being able to place it in this global context and being able to place it in the context even of other insect transmitted diseases. And then you're bringing this back to people who've been the keepers of this other story.
Yeah, they were always really surprised about how much I was learning. And I don't think that they saw it in contradiction to the stories that we had in our home. I think they saw it as sort of additions, appendices to their story, basically. Like they're still going to hold on to, like, she was contaminated by eating fruit. That's it, period. But it was like additional information. And I think they appreciated, I think they were also very moved to hear about the stories of other families, because we were very isolated with our experience. We never met another family who had been impacted by Chagas disease. And so I think like there was sort of an emotional journey sometimes especially for my mother and her other sister, to hear like, yeah, that someone was having cardiac issues, that they were also in and out of hospitals. I think it's sort of that strange experience that I think people have, in any kind of like patient support group, right? Where you're grateful to not be alone. And then at the same time, you don't want anyone else to be suffering from this either. Probably the most surprising story that I brought back home was the fact that this parasite can be transmitted from a mother to a child during pregnancy. So congenital Chagas was definitely not something that we knew about at all. My auntie had not been able to have children herself, but we had no idea that this existed. And that was quite a shock, because I think the public health campaigns go underway in different parts of Latin America and to different capacities. But historically, people have really thought about this as an old person's disease, because that's when you see the symptoms. So you could be infected as a teenager, even as a child, but now it's like 30 years later and you're in your 40s, and now you're exhibiting shortness of breath. Now you need a pacemaker or a defibrillator. And so it was really, and that's actually what one patient said to me, like her father was infected, her sister as well. Her sister was in need of a pacemaker, but she really thought this doesn't happen to children. So there's just sort of like limited public health information that's out there. So that was probably the most surprising news that I brought back home, and really disturbing, because I learned that around the same time that the Zika virus was, happening and underway and in the headlines. And so everyone was talking about that. So it felt terrifying, to know that this disease could also be transmitted that way. And that that was another part that was shocking, that there's about 8,000 babies that are born every year with this disease. And in the US, that number is smaller. It's like anywhere between 60 and 300, but we don't do prenatal screening in this country. That's something that I'm hopeful will change in the coming years, that we'll start to screen. Because when I dug into the numbers, of course, putting on the journalist hat, I was like, well, how many babies are being born to women from these regions? So that would be South America, Central America, and Mexico who are being born in the US, and it's 700,000 babies every year. So that's quite a number of children that we continue to miss. Yeah.
Right. That's another public health piece. And it's something that I heard a lot of stories about when I was working on Wicked Bugs, is whether it's someone coming from Latin America to the United States, or you can imagine similar journeys elsewhere in the world, where you come from one place and you come to another place and there's no expertise in this new city or in this new country about the health issues that you might have dealt with back home. And so there's really no sense of, we have to remember that not everybody has had the same trajectory around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the US, because of the way medical schools are set up, there's not a lot of teaching on parasitic diseases. The idea is you're going to graduate from med school and go into a specialty, and it's not going to be parasitic diseases because there isn't money. And, I was able to talk to a professor who does teach about parasitic diseases and was able to be really honest with me. And he's like, my students are graduating with, enormous amounts of debt, and they're not choosing neglected diseases. And so, it's kind of a little miraculous that he gets to teach one course on this, and cover it. But, I think the push really has to come from public health advocates and the public health side of it to change things.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know, Jimmy Carter's foundation, the Carter Center, has a huge health component that's focused on insect transmitted diseases. Yes. And I had to go look because I couldn't remember if Chagas disease was one of them or not, and it isn't. They have about 6 others that they work on, but they're really committed to actually eliminating them. And it takes that kind of focused, in this case, a big foundation to really say, we are really going to go in, and it's going to be village by village, and it's going to be one pill at a time or one vaccine at a time until there are 0 people left with this particular disease. And without that, where are we?
Yeah, that was a big aha moment for me while I was working on this book, is exactly that, realizing that so many times we've contained diseases rather than eradicate them, even though eradication can be possible. And so with Chagas disease, disproportionately affects immigrants who are also in low wage jobs and don't have the same kind of access to healthcare that others have. And so it really, and it's not, it's more akin to Lyme disease. It's not, you're not going to catch it from being in the room with someone who has it. So it really is incredibly easy for this to be neglected. But the same is true when I looked at the history of tuberculosis, and it's like, yeah, we don't worry about TB in the US anymore, but we did not eradicate it globally. And so when you look at the US, like who has tuberculosis, it tends to be immigrant communities or those who have been in prison or in homeless shelter, those kind of congregate living spaces. So same thing with HIV. You look at HIV in the US and you think, oh, like it's not an issue anymore. And it's completely an epidemic in the Black community in the South, right? So we've made strategic decisions, and I'm a little nervous about what that means in terms of COVID. I feel like I really appreciate, Biden pushing now for vaccines to get to other countries, because we can't have just a containment policy. It really needs to be eradication.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, I'm assuming that the book was completely done and turned in before COVID started, or right as it was starting. Is that about right?
It was, yeah.
Yeah. So now, in hindsight, has anything changed in terms of your perspective? Like when you think about this other disease, and now that we've had a year of COVID, is there any new insight or any new take that has come to you?
We actually halted the presses, because it was in the beginnings of production. And so when the pandemic hit, we had to pause and say, okay, how do we address this in the book? Just because of the timeline. And what was surprising was how easy it was in the book to actually transition. So actually, Amy, you probably saw a copy earlier than this. So there's now like some new pages on COVID, because it was disturbing, how easy it was to, all the racial disparities in healthcare that I was talking about with Chagas disease and with tuberculosis and HIV, completely came to the forefront and still are at the forefront with COVID. So even vaccination rates, I think just today I was hearing a news report about vaccination rates in California overall are doing really good, but they're disproportionately much higher for wealthier communities and white communities than they are for communities of color. So those kind of disparities are, I think what was are in our face, and I think COVID put them in our face, but I also think it's really easy to forget about them once the crisis is over. So I feel like my shift in my perspective is that I'm hopeful that maybe because of the scale of this pandemic that we're not going to forget so quickly or want to put it away so quickly. But I think that's still, is yet to be determined, if this pandemic has really changed how we think about public policy, how we think about healthcare and healthcare access and racial disparities. I think it still remains to be seen.
Yeah, right. I know. I thought about that too, and how this has been a year where anyone can see that what's happening in India affects us, and so on. So maybe those lessons will stick with us. I know we're going to start taking questions pretty soon. So everybody think of some questions and please put them in the Q&A, and we're about to get into that. Before we do, I was interested in a little bit about the writing process. Did you sort of write pieces of the book as they felt complete to you, and then later had to sort of work out the timeline? Like, what was the process of actually writing this narrative? Because it moves around in time. You've got this family story that goes back a ways, and then you've got, I know what the research process is like. Sometimes you do one bit of it early, even though that's really more for the end of the book, and then you have to kind of rearrange everything in your mind to put it into a narrative. So what was that like?
Yeah, it's so fun to talk with you because you really know it. And that describes it perfectly. So, I would say that probably, so I was writing, even though I was not going to write it as a memoir, I was not planning to write much about my auntie, because as I was learning new information, I was gaining insights into my childhood experiences. I did find myself writing, I would say vignettes. I was writing those sort of like little fragments and just thinking, oh, this is kind of for me. And this is to get more clarity about what happened in our family. But what I was really, and I kind of put it away. And what I was really focused on, I would say probably the patient stories, which makes up the third part of the book, is actually probably what was written first. Because initially I thought I will do a much deeper dive into their stories, make them the backbone of the book. And so yes, it's actually part 3 that happened first. And then the research I was writing as I went along. I also did have like the big, okay, I've got 6 months, I need to sit down and start, polishing and writing further. But I would say that a chunk of the research I did, the research writing I did as I went along. What was really challenging actually ended up being that memoir part, where I gave my editor, I don't even know how many pages. I should go back and look. And she's amazing, and she returned it to me with like, here are chapters in this sort of long text that you sent me, which was amazing. But it was almost at the last moment possible that the structure for the book came to me. The original title was actually In Search of the Kissing Bug, so that got shortened. But I realized, oh right, I am searching. I've been searching for so much, and it sounds really obvious, as you were saying before. It sounds really obvious now, but it was quite a moment of lights going off in my head of like, oh my gosh, yes, I'm searching. And so that was when I realized that I could organize it around those searching, that kind of searching for the family story in part 1, and then searching more for the medicine and the science in part 2, because I felt like I wanted readers to have that, not necessarily super technical information, but definitely the medicine and the science, that kind of understanding before they went into reading about the families. And part of it was that my family is not the only one that has mythology around it, just like the patient who said, oh, but this is a disease that only affects old people. I was having that kind of material in the chapters that were about the patients. And so I was realizing, okay, I need the readers to have the technical information so that they can really appreciate now how it looks on the ground in someone's day-to-day life. So, but that's what I can't, I think I took a picture at one point of like a million Post-it notes on the wall of like, if I move the part about Dr. Chagas to the middle, will it make sense? I mean, there was just craziness all around. And at one point, the Post-it notes were all attached together in little columns because I was, just trying to figure it out. And my words of wisdom are like, you will find the structure. It happens when you least expect it, apparently, or at least it did for. Has that been true for you with finding the structures for your book, or are you the other way where like, because I know some writers need to have that structure at the beginning before any writing can happen and need to like work from the outline and.
I think for me, one of my editors gave me a very good insight early on, which is that the author, in this case, is the narrator. I mean, we're talking about a book written in the first person, but you're a stand-in for the reader, and so the story needs to be experienced in such a way that a reader coming in fresh is making these discoveries with you. And so the tricky bit is you can't know too much in the beginning. So it's like this job of shuffling it around and making sure that you as the narrator are not terribly informed at the beginning, and that you go through a character arc just like in a novel, and you come out the other end sort of transformed by what you've learned, because that's what the reader wants to do along with you. And and I think that makes this one of these books that will be read just in the way that you were looking for, like Rebecca Skloot or Mary Roach. This is a book that will stand up and will be read by people who are thinking about science journalism and science writing in this very kind of like approachable and enthralling and engrossing way, where you go on a journey. Like, I think that's my favorite kind of science writing.
Thank you so much. That means a lot to me.
Good stuff. Well, do you want to jump into questions? Is there anything else?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay. All right. Let me just get into this. So this is a great question to start off with. So Anne wants to know about the CDC says that few cases of Chagas disease from contact with bugs have been documented in this country. And this is such an important thing. Do people know when they've been bitten? Are many people who are bitten unaware of it?
This is a great question. So yes, most people, when they are bitten, it's very easy to miss it. So I'll talk both perspectives in Latin America, and then here you'll get your bug bites. You'll have like allergic reaction to where there was a bite, but that can be easy to miss, especially if you don't know, if you're living in an area with a lot of kissing bugs. Here I'm talking about rural areas of South America or Central America. You don't know that they are super dangerous, or sometimes in the communities they do know they're dangerous and you should stay away from them, but they're part of your day-to-day life. The symptoms are not dramatic. So the acute stage will be those first 2 months, and you might have a fever, you might have aches. At the most, you might have a swollen eyelid where some of that material, the parasite, entered your body. But those symptoms tend to resolve, in most cases, tend to resolve pretty quickly, which is part of what is so challenging, is that there aren't these like huge red flag kind of alerts that would, make someone seek medical attention. And then the reality also for rural areas in South America and Central America and Mexico is that even if you did want to get medical access, you oftentimes can't. People are living very far away from doctors and hospitals. And in the US, it's similar. You're going to the insects here. You don't tend to get that swollen eyelid, but you will have like allergic skin reactions. But you're usually you either camping, or you live out on a ranch, or you have that kind of exposure, and you don't think of it as being anything different than any other bug bite that you happen to be getting at the moment. And it's not like Lyme disease where you're looking for a very kind of distinctive rash or anything like that. So it is really easy to miss it in that acute stage, which for adults is really difficult, because in that acute stage, there are 2 medications that can oftentimes be successful in eradicating that parasite. But once you're out of that acute stage, the medications don't work in the same way. And then you go into that chronic phase. The CDC has documented fewer than 100 people. It has very stringent rules for how it decides that someone is infected. You actually have to test positive on 2 out of 3 tests. And that's because, it's a very there was a scientist who hates it when I say that the parasite is cunning, but the parasite is cunning. And the parasite can really, can be very elusive at times. And so, and it is possible to get false negatives and false positives. So the CDC has those rules in place for that. A lot of the people who have tested positive in the US, people that I interviewed, it was mixed where, I interviewed one woman in California who clearly had a bug bite, but it was also so arbitrary in the sense that she was out on a piece of property in California with her spouse and their children, and no one except her got a bite and got infected. Everybody was tested ultimately. Another woman who I write about in the book, most likely was infected at her mother's house, where she would visit sometimes in Texas, but her mother was not infected herself. So it's a little bit, we can't say that, because you have exposure, you're definitely going to get bit and going to get infected. It's quite complicated, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, no, parasitic diseases are like that. It's not a guarantee that you're automatically going to get infected. And most of us do tend to not think too much about bug bites. And we don't think about it when we travel either. When I was touring for Wicked Bugs, I would always tell people, tell me where you're going on vacation and I will ruin your trip. I'll tell you what's going to kill you. But I am one of those people, like I travel with a lot of bug control products and everybody else on the trip will make fun of me. But, I've gone to the CDC website ahead of time. I've gotten my vaccines, my travel vaccines, and I'm loaded up with protective stuff. And it's because, I think the thing here is nature is powerful. And we understand that when it comes to something like, here on the Pacific coast, we understand that when it comes to the ocean, you sort of don't turn your back on the ocean. We understand it when we think about fire and flood, but we forget it when it comes to a little tiny insect.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's see. So a few more questions. Can you talk about other insect diseases? Why is malaria, for example, so better known? Do you have a take you want to?
Yeah, well, malaria is, incredibly prevalent, affects even millions more people, affects people in many, many regions of the world. And so I would say that's part of the reason that it gets more attention in certain ways. Although, so I found this surprising myself, malaria is actually considered a neglected disease. There is no reason that we should not have eradication of malaria, but it disproportionately affects poor people around the world. In fact, during this pandemic, one of the medical op-eds that I read that has really stayed with me was from a researcher in South Africa, I think it was, and she was thinking about what, so she works on malaria, and she was thinking, what would it be like if we threw, the resources that we're throwing at COVID, if we threw this at malaria, and her lab was having to put on hold everything, of course, that they were doing for malaria patients to focus on COVID. And for her, it was just such a painful reminder of the inequities. We don't put more money towards malaria because it's not coming around the world. It's not coming into wealthy countries in the same way that it comes to these very poor countries. So so I think that's part, I know, I feel like we all know malaria, but it's actually neglected. It's in terms of funding. It's not as neglected as, in the same way that Chagas and river blindness and all these other diseases are, but it's still actually considered a neglected disease.
Yeah, and this might answer also another question. Maureen is saying, if the disease is caused by parasites, is it possible that there are assassin bugs that are not infected and therefore the bite would not result in Chagas disease? And the answer is yes. And that's true of mosquitoes as well. So for instance, a mosquito here in Portland doesn't pose a lot of threat because malaria is also, it's a parasitic disease. They got to pick it up from one place and sort of deliver it to another place. And so it does, all these terms are something so familiar to us. It has to do with community spread, and a certain critical mass in a community, suddenly there's a bunch of bugs walking around with this disease.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that has really changed this last year, Amy, right? We have all become so nuanced in the language of medicine and science,
Right.
yeah, in ways that we were not before.
Contact tracing, I know, we have all these terms. Let's see, Nancy wants to know, well, there's two Nancys with two questions. Where are these bugs found and what's the treatment for Chagas disease?
Yeah, so kissing bugs, largely found in South America, Central America, and Mexico in rural areas. They're very picky about their temperature. You know, I say they're Goldilocks. They don't like it too hot, too cold. It has to be just right, you know, in the kind of 60s temperate climate. But they are here in the US as well, as I said before, in the South and the Southwest, all over California. Texas has quite a number of species of these insects, so it stands out for that reason. And there are two medications. So one has been approved by the FDA for use in the United States. It's called Benzenidazole. And the World Health Organization actually considers it to be an essential medicine because researchers don't understand why, but for children, even past the acute phase of the disease, treatment with that medication can be really effective. And it can be really effective with newborns that are born with this disease. For adults in the chronic stage, it's lowering sort of the parasite load in your body. It's very essential for women who are thinking about having children, because some studies have shown that it can perhaps lower the chances of you passing that parasite along to your child during pregnancy. But yes, that drug is now FDA approved, which is a good thing, and was quite a struggle by advocates and patients.
And I think one more thing that might be helpful for people to remember too is that sometimes these, and this is again so familiar with what we've been talking about with COVID for the last year, but sometimes these diseases become more prevalent in the human population because of changes in human behavior. So for instance, in Latin America, people living closer and closer to wilderness areas and deforestation happening. And so, if there was once a time where by and large, the bugs could kind of go hang out by themselves and people were somewhere else, like we're seeing changes in the ecosystem that are bringing us into closer contact and more opportunities for exposure.
Yeah, absolutely. And here in the US, the same thing is happening. That's what was really surprising to me about Texas, because I became so fascinated, like, what's going on in Texas? Texas does not have the highest number of people with this disease. It's actually California, far and away, has like the most people in the country with this disease because of its immigrant population. But people in Texas are seeing more and more of this insect. They're seeing their dogs contracted. There's canine Chagas disease. And it's exactly what you're describing, which is that more and more of Texas is getting developed. So I don't know that that's necessarily like the cause and effect, but that was like a feature of what's happening in Texas that stands out to me. And, someone I interviewed said, oh, my wife opened up her purse and found one in her bag on her iPhone, of all places, But from his perspective, and this was a veterinarian, and from his perspective, it's like, this is kissing bug country, and we're showing up and turning these ranches into, corporate headquarters and housing for people that are coming to work at these companies. And so we are entering from the insect's perspective, we are the ones who are entering their territory and destabilizing them. So yeah, it's interesting. It was an interesting process for me to think about it from the insect's perspective too.
Yeah, right. I just think this is such an incredible book, and it could not be more timely. So I hope you guys will check out the book. And I also want to say, as we're wrapping up, I mean, we have a couple more minutes. Feel free to put another question in or two in. But I just want to say that, whenever I speak at an independent bookstore, I always urge people, buy a book. I used to own a bookstore. I can tell you firsthand, the only way they stay open is if people show up and buy books. And the last time I did an event at Powell's, I said that, and it sounded so absurd to say because the building was full and there were tons of people there. And I said, I know it's impossible to imagine a moment when Powell's doesn't exist, but literally even a huge bookstore like this keeps its doors open because every day people walk in and buy books, and that's the only way that math works. So now more than ever, please, get something at Powell's and support all your independent bookstores. It's so important.
Absolutely. And they have signed copies, signed book plates for the
Good
books
for
too,
you.
which
That's
is
wonderful.
wonderful. So yeah, there's many reasons to shop from Powell's. I agree.
Yes, absolutely. Any other questions, comments before we wrap up? Anything else that you want to say to folks?
Thank you for coming. I really hope you pick up a copy from Powell's, and thank you so much for being here tonight with us. Thank you, Amy. I'm a big fan of your work, so this is a treat.
Yeah, this was great. It's nice to see your face.
All right, well, thank you so much. Thank you both. Thanks. It was wonderful to host you both this evening. And thank you for everyone for tuning in tonight. Please consider purchasing a copy of Daisy's new book right here. You can get it on powells.com. And while you're there, please be sure to check out our lineup of other events. And we look forward to seeing you at another one very soon. So Daisy and Amy, thanks so much again for joining us tonight and for the great talk. And
Thank you.
have a good night, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.